You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Palestinians return to whatever remains of northern Gaza. Why do people apparently know less about the Holocaust the longer it is commemorated? And will a dwindling of urban traffic din just make us more annoyed by other noise? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Tessa Szyszkowicz and Yossi Meckelberg will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the UNHCR's Special Advisor on Climate Action about the accelerating relationship between climate and refugee exflows. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Tessa Szyszkowicz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter and author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit, and by Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello, good evening.
Helpfully, by way of not necessarily light introductory banter, sort of heavy and foreboding introductory banter, you have both been doing things which are germane to at least one of the subjects we will be discussing. Tessa, you were watching a very particular musical performance in Newcastle.
I did. It was part of the Brundibar Festival, where only composers who wrote music during the Holocaust, some of them in concentration camps, were performed. And one was from Hans Gahl, Austrian Jewish composer who was very famous in the 20s and 30s in Austria and Germany. And he was actually writing a cabaret program on the Isle of Man, where he was interned after he escaped.
The jazz hotbed of the Isle of Man.
Yeah, exactly. So there was, unfortunately, Britain was very scared that the German-speaking refugees would be possibly part of being spies for the Nazis on their way to Britain in 1940. So they interned them on the Isle of Man in a camp where he spent half a year. And while he was there, he wrote this comedy program, because you need a very good sense of humor to survive this world then and now.
Indeed so. And on which note, Yossi, you have, as I understand it, been up a hill trying to forge friendships across various divides among a nation's youth.
Yes, I was in the Peak District, so yeah, dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's always an uphill struggle.
Hey!
and I went to a workshop with an organization called FODIP, which is the Forum of Israel-Palestinian Dialogue, a wonderful small NGO that try to bring youth, or not trying, successfully bring together young Jews, Christians and Muslims to discuss the conflict in a safe environment, in a safe space in which, and obviously in the last 15 months there is a lot of pain, there are a lot of arguments, but created this space that we can all talk about it. So ran 2 workshops about the conflict and how do we talk about the conflict without this descending into quarreling, and also not importing the conflict in our own society here, but try to help to resolve it there.
Genuinely, though, did you get a sense that much progress is being made? Because I think what you're talking about there is important, that with the best will in the world, people trying to even discuss this conflict get very hesitant and nervous and awkward around what they can say and can't say, or should or shouldn't say.
So because it's a kind of a safe space for this, say what you feel, respect the feelings of others and what they are going through, but the more thing, be factual. Because, especially these days that you can find whatever you like on social media, whether it's right or wrong. So also to help them to find the right information, the facts about it, and then draw their own conclusion. But also get used to the interfaith conversation, because in this kind of situation, everything becomes so tribal. So the idea that you actually manage to have a good conversation about it, it's already an achievement.
Well, we will start in Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are on the march, having been permitted to return home to the north of the Gaza Strip after 15 months of war, though many, if not most, will be resigned to the likelihood that they no longer have homes to return to. They have been allowed to move after Hamas agreed to release 6 more of the Israeli hostages they have held since October 7th, 2023. They will be freed later this week, at which Israel will release further Palestinians currently serving sentences in Israeli prisons. In an ominous subplot, US President Donald Trump has airily suggested that most or all of Gaza's population could be relocated to Egypt and Jordan, whose level of enthusiasm for such a plan is unlikely to be high. Tessa, first of all, if we're going to try and follow on from Yossi's attempt at optimism there, let's attempt optimism here. Are we surprised by how well this arrangement is actually holding up? Because this ceasefire hasn't collapsed yet. Things are still happening more or less in the way they were supposed to happen.
Yeah, I think it's in the interest of both sides, Israel and Hamas, at the moment to continue as long as they can possibly continue. And that means Israel wants the hostages that are alive first. So the women, as we saw, have been released now. There are a few more, as you said, that might be Thursday or Friday and then also on Saturday out. The problem is, and that we saw also this afternoon, that Hamas already provided now the list of those who are alive and who are dead on the first 33 hostages. And so there are now families in Israel that will learn that their family members will not come back alive. And so it's becoming more and more difficult to keep on going with these exchanges, because once people know that not so many of the hostages are actually alive, as cynical as this whole is, even the conversation about it is really difficult, I think. But Hamas has not been saying till now how many are alive, because they are hoping to keep the ceasefire going so that the Palestinians, the civilians, can go back to the north and start sort of kind of finding their life back. And Hamas, of course, wants to stay in power also. As long as they have hostages that are alive in their hands, they can also negotiate. The moment there are no alive hostages anymore, even if Israel is very keen on getting also the bodies or the remains of hostages back, it's still a lot less urgent, of course, to get them back and to have a ceasefire that costs Israeli government ministers a lot to keep going with the ceasefire, because they would actually prefer to keep the war going because they want to destroy the rest of the Hamas leadership. And so we are in a very, very intense moment, but there are still interests that are strong to keep the ceasefire going.
Yossi, as we have discussed many times on these programmes, we have not yet had any sense from anybody really about what they envisage the future of Gaza being, how this will be addressed, moving ahead, because there is obviously a colossal task of rebuilding that is going to need doing if, of course, assuming the people who live there are going to continue living there. And as I was saying, we have heard from President Donald Trump that he has some ideas about this. But is there is there an amount of money or an amount of anything on earth that would either persuade those people to go to Egypt or Jordan, or for Egypt or Jordan to take them?
Probably not. And this is really unhelpful intervention on the side of President Trump. Let's call it, they try to, will encourage people. This is transfer. There is when they say out of their, free will they lived, who is going to negotiate with every single Palestinian? At the end of the day, you can negotiate it with government. Are they going to impose people to leave their homes? This kind of ideas have been floated many times. No, the people want to stay in their own country. This is, they were fighting for independence, for their freedom. They know how they're going to be treated in some places. Let alone, it's going to destabilize definitely Jordan. And Jordan probably been the most generous country when it comes to refugees. But the pressure on resources, mainly water, and other, is impossible. So 500,000, 700,000, this is not going to happen. I want anyone to show me one Palestinian leader that is ready to negotiate transferring 1.5 million of his people to another country and still staying in power. So I think we need to look. It's not as Donald Trump portrays, it looked like a demolition style. He's thinking already in terms of building another tower, Trump Tower. This is not the way to address it. It's first and foremost a political, a humanitarian, a human rights issue, and we need to go from there. Then if people at one point decided they want to live, they will live in any free country. But it won't happen before there is an agreement that Israel leaves Gaza Strip. There are international forces that look after security, the reconstruction of Gaza. And there can be some creative ideas. For instance, some people spoke for many years about extending the size of Gaza, exchange of territories, not of people. And this will create more space to rebuild Gaza, but not the idea of transfer.
Well, let's move along somewhat, because 80 years ago today, soldiers of the 322nd Rifle Division of the Soviet Red Army arrived at what would shortly become one of Earth's most infamous addresses. Only a few thousand prisoners remained at Auschwitz, shorthand for a complex of Nazi concentration and extermination camps near the Polish city of Krakow. But Auschwitz has since become a sort of emblem of the Holocaust entire, and the anniversary of its liberation a day of remembrance. In the current climate, however, tensions surround the occasion. Russia's present president is not invited for obvious reasons, and significant chunks of electorates around the Western world are in thrall to far-right demagogues. Tessa, there are about 50 survivors attending the commemorations, and obviously they are a dwindling crew of people. Is that going to be an especially dangerous moment, do you think, when the Holocaust actually slips from living memory, when there aren't people still with us who can say, I was there, this happened?
I think yes, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think a lot of people just, even if you educate people very well, will not already now, if you look at these opinion polls, do not believe the Holocaust even happened. So, of course, if you have people who can tell what happened themselves personally, and there are few left who still do that, for example, in schools in Austria, and I find it really wonderful that they still do this after so many years. The people are now in 80s, 90s. There are still theater productions that are being done with the last witnesses, and it's now on video. There's a lot of, Yad Vashem, but a lot of organizations in the whole world have collected the testimonies of survivors. And, of course, historians have written books about it and documentaries have been made. There's a lot of material if you want to know what happened in the Second World War and what the Shoah, the Holocaust, was about. And it's quite astonishing how difficult it is to keep the truth out there and not be washed away by misinformation that a lot of people spread on purpose. And this threat comes from the far right in Austria or in Germany especially, which is especially shameful, of course, in these countries.
But let's take a look at how astonishing it is, because Tessa's obviously absolutely right, Yossi, that this event, the Holocaust, was meticulously documented as it happened by the people who were doing it. But a recent study by the Claims Conference, and you've probably seen these figures, they are absolutely astonishing, so bear with me a second. 46% of French people aged 18 to 29 had never heard of the Holocaust or weren't sure what it was. 20% of French adults did not know what the Holocaust was. 14 and 12% of Germans aged 18 to 29 had no idea, and nearly half of Americans are unable to name a single camp associated with the Holocaust. This strikes me as, even speaking as somebody who has probably read far too much history and news media than is good for them, this strikes me as completely incredible. Like, how can you actually be a sentient adult human being who has lived in the post-World War II period and have absolutely no idea that this occurred?
It's incredible, and it's just the finger should be pointed at the education system, the social structure that's not make sure that But
genuinely, don't our education systems absolutely hammer this as well they should?
I think in the UK it does, and I think it's much better in the UK. I know from my own daughter's experience, They went to visit Auschwitz, and it was not a Jewish school. Mm-hmm. It was actually a Catholic school. So they were, and every year during Holocaust Memorial Day, it was discussed at school. It's a failure. It's no doubt a failure, because it's not only about what happened there. It's also the lessons. 80 years there. Because it's not that genocide stopped in 1945. Indeed. We had since then. And it's not about comparative suffering or comparative genocide. But these traits in human behavior continue, whether it's Cambodia or Rwanda and South Sudan. So in order for us to eradicate this behavior, we need to remember our history. And, obviously I see as a second generation of Holocaust survivor that we have a duty here to keep talking about it and the suffering, because the suffering doesn't stop, not with those who vanished, not with the first generation that survived, but goes beyond this. What does it mean? Not only not to survive, but also to survive the Holocaust. And as you say, they are in their 80s, and those who survive are now in the 80s and the 90s. And when they got... And it's interesting because, as you say, if you want to find this information, it's everywhere. Even following Schindler List. Steven Spielberg created a huge library of testimony. If you go to the Museum of the Holocaust here in London, in the Imperial War Museum, you can find thousands and thousands of testimonies. It's how we bring young people to go and read it, how we create an environment that people are ready to be educated about such a horrible event.
I mean, which leads to the bleak follow-up question, which I will put to you, Tessa, because these numbers are staggering. I mean, to me, it is barely less incredible than finding that 46% of French people aged 18 to 29 don't know their own names or where they live. I mean, I really don't understand how you can not know this. So the bleak follow-up question becomes, do these people actually not know, or do they choose not to know?
Well, I think a lot of people have also other interests. So a lot of this globe is busy, as Yossi just said. Was busy with Cambodian catastrophes, and
I'd be willing to bet that people who've never heard of the Holocaust probably couldn't give you chapter and verse on Pol Pot either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is all sort of a big sort of. It's a very. Let's put it like this. I think we should try to educate people. I wouldn't worry too much about that people don't know the details of the Holocaust, because the main thing is, of course, that people sort of think that it's good to live in a democracy. And that's where the problem starts now, because a lot of people seem to have forgotten that. So if you look now that in countries like Austria, 29% of the population voted for a far-right party this fall, and they will now probably become also the leaders in the next coalition government. Then you think, okay, so we are worried that the Holocaust is not remembered properly, but we should also be worried that we don't create a new... it is a big jump now from going to a coalition of far-right parties in 2025 to the next Holocaust. But there's a danger that these parties do not respect minorities, do not respect democracy, do not respect pluralism in societies. And I think that's very, very worrying. And I also saw this opinion poll that in Austria, 62% of the people asked in this opinion poll if they're worried about the next Holocaust happening, said yes, 62%. So you think that there's about a third of the population who votes for the far right and 2/3 that are worried that people vote for the far right. And we should really try to balance this out with a lot of fight for democratic institutions and procedures in a country.
But there is also an element that education systems are afraid to deal with controversial issues. The more we go away from it, most of the controversial issues schools don't want to deal because they're afraid it's much easier to teach physics and chemistry because no parent will come and complain about it. No one will say it's controversial. But if you start dealing with these values about plurality, about minorities, about gender, then you have what you see in the United States, how it can easily polarize, so they avoid it altogether. And actually what we need is exactly the opposite, to be brave about it and to deal with the controversial issues in a way, again, creating this safe spaces to discuss this, and also with the pain that involved with that.
Well, let's move along entirely. And here in the UK, 200 companies employing around 5,000 people have signed up to a 4-day working week with no loss of pay for their employees. The companies concerned are mostly from the charity, technology and marketing sectors, who appear to have agreed with the Clue in the Name 4-Day Week Foundation that the 5-day week is a relic of an earlier economic age. Similar things have been attempted previously to varying extents in Iceland, Japan, Portugal and Belgium. We will now pause for a brief mirthless chuckle from 3 media workers at the idea of such a part-time proposition as even a 5-day week. Yossi, first of all, can you see this catching on?
I think in some sectors, probably, but I think really it has to go sector by sector, and also to create a fairer society that people are. We know that we work right now in a society that is overworked and underpaid, and I don't mean only the media people around this table. We know with cost of living, also actually people taking more and more jobs and doing more and more instead of. But there is a cost to that too. And the mental cost, and we see what happens about the well-being of people. So we need to create a new balance. And I think COVID was a sort to create some space between, how many days we work, but also it comes together with working in office instead of working remotely. But it varies. You see, you can't have GPs, for instance, working from home.
Oh, they've tried.
But, I mean, you have appointment on Skype. You can't have a surgeon, for instance, operates from home. This will be a bit difficult. So or a war correspondent reporting from home.
Again, one hears stories.
Well, there is a lack of professionalism, one might suggest, with this. So we need, but it's really the balance between work and well-being. And I think in recent years, there is more people work more and not looking after their well-being.
I mean, Tessa, it's a knock-on from the pandemic, isn't it? This is companies trying to find a way between having people in the office, which I think is actually by and large good for a company because people get to know each other. It's how you foster a corporate culture. It's how people have ideas. It's how people collaborate and, things happen. Versus the fact that quite a lot of people did acquire an appetite for, not getting out of their dressing gown all day.
That's true. I think, and I would hope that we can keep some of the positive effects of the pandemic work style that we developed.
I've compromised by just wearing my dressing gown to the office.
Yes, exactly. It's really nice to see that. But in general, the flexibility is a good thing. And I think that's also, we will keep some of these things because some work can be done very well at home. It's also very good if you have to commute from far away, that you go 4 days a week into the office, but then you get a day where you can also save this time. For companies to include this in their calculations could be well worth. But of course, we know a lot of people, including ourselves, not only self-employed, but also employees who could never just afford to say okay, 4 days a week is enough. And the other 3 days, we sort of take care of our lovely kids or whoever is at home, the cats, the dogs, and close the computer. So we have to work a lot, much deeper also on the structural ideas. How can work be distributed within a company? Can you hire more people? Can you compromise? Because this idea that is here promoted now by these 200 companies is that you don't get cut in your pay if you work less. And that is for small companies, let's say, that are not NGOs and don't get funding from whoever. It's simply not possible often to say okay, we hire now 2 people for the 7 days together, and then 3.5 days one works, and then 3.5 the other person. But we should look at models, and there are these models, and I think it's really, really important to try to find ways where people do not have to work 14 hours a day, like in jobs that are always...
The productivity of that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we hear, like yesterday from the conservatives here, we need more flexible labor market. And we know exactly when conservative talks about flexible labor market, we can get rid of you. Yeah, we can do all this restructuring and cut your salaries and make sure you're so flexible that you barely can make a living.
Well, to Paris now, where it seems there is good news and bad news vis-à-vis the ambient soundtrack of the city. Brut Paris, which measures noise pollution in Paris, has noted that the din once raised by petrol-powered cars is way down as people ditch the chauffeurs for electric updates or leave them at home. That's the good news. The bad news is an uptick in rackets associated with a more pedestrianised society. Chatter from outdoor cafes, merriment outside bars, the shriek of tourists who've been given a bill for €10 for a flat warm Coke, and this being Paris and all, accordions as well, probably. Input from this on our panel shortly, but first here is Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, Simon Bouvier.
We in France have a reputation for having the innate ability to find something to complain about. And even among the French, Parisians tend to take the crown for negativity. One thing we love to complain about is noise. Back before Paris's current mayor, Anne Hidalgo, took charge, we complained about backed-up boulevards and the drone of idling engines. Now that Hidalgo has restricted traffic in many areas of the city, we complain about that, but we've also turned our attention to party animals. Indeed, the curmudgeons over at a collective called Droit au Sommeil, or Right to Sleep, calculated that terraces had expanded by over 48% since the spring of 2021, and loud sidewalk revelry late at night has too. In other words, now that the din of horns and rattling exhaust is gone, the sound of people having a good time has gotten out of hand. In all seriousness, if you happen to live on Rue de Bussy or Rue de la Roquette, you probably aren't getting much sleep at night. But fear not, there is a very French fix: government subsidies. There are generous ones available for changing out the aging windows still present in much of Paris for modern, double-glazed equivalents that are soundproof. But be ready to complain about all the paperwork required.
That was Simon Bouvier in our Paris bureau. Tessa, do we basically take away from this the fact that, well, as a Frenchman once very nearly wrote, everything other people do is basically just annoying, isn't it?
Yes, and I basically would also rather be disturbed by people sitting in an outdoor cafe drinking beautiful red French
Well, even
wine.
if it's right under your bedroom window.
Look, there are restrictions. People don't usually do that at 2 o'clock in the morning. I know that in many cities in Europe and whoever else, people at 10 o'clock at the and the people have to take in the garden service, it's finish at 11 latest and all this. I would really shout out for a little bit of hedonistic noise in cities over anything else. And I'm very happy that the car noise is down and with it also the pollution. And we should go with bicycles, drink water when we cycle. And if we go per foot, then we should sit and drink a nice glass of wine in the evenings. And we can also be respectful, of course, of our environment.
I was once taken to a very pleasant bar in the old city of Valletta in Malta, where there were people drinking outside, but I was warned by the bar staff not to occupy a particular section of pavement because the woman whose flat overlooks it was periodically in the habit of tipping water over people who were making too much noise. I always kind of felt like she and I would get on. Yossi, where are you on this? Are people entitled to peace and quiet if they live in a big city, or should they just suck it up if they have chosen to live in a big city?
First, since both Tessa and I love cycling, we love the idea of less cars, less pollution, less noise.
Okay.
So this is the starting point. People that don't like this noise can move to the suburbs. They don't have to live. If you live in a vibrant city, which we love, vibrant cities, then it comes with the price of noise. And actually, there are people that find they are much happier not to live in the suburb where it's too quiet, but they like actually this noise that comes.
Those people are insane, though.
Well, I mean, sanity is in the eye of the beholder. And as long as it's not too noisy, it's not as we know in some places when people get too drunk, as long as it's civilized and it's closed in reasonable hours, I think there is charm to it.
Is there I mean, I assume we can all agree that people who play audio out loud on their phones on the train should be put in stocks and pelted with last week's cabbages. But beyond that, I'll ask you each in turn, is there a particular urban noise that does grind your gears, Tessa, that you would like to see expunged?
Well, I think the car noise being down is super, and it goes with, electric cars, for example, just don't have all this gear change in the curve kind of noise. So that's very, very good. I think if you live next to big crossroads and you hear lorries sort of making noise, that is really, really uncomfortable. I think people should also really take care of their telephones not having a ringtone on in public transport. I
genuinely think now that the EU has fixed the whole universal charger thing, the next step is it should be actually illegal to sell phones that can actually make any noise whatsoever without headphones.
But then we come to the human voice. You should be careful, Andrew. You're going down a slippery road.
Absolutely in favour of outlawing that as well. I also think buskers should be arrested. Yossi, anything of this ilk?
You see, I grew up in Tel Aviv, which is such a noisy place.
It is a noisy place.
A noisy place. You see, people are shouting from one balcony to another. In the middle of the day, the balconies are open, the windows are open, and you can hear everything that happen, and then the bus, and then let alone the cars, the way the people drive, and actually all the time. So when I'm in London, I don't hear anything when I'm in Europe, so I can't even complain.
Well, on that upbeat note, Yossi Meckelberg and Tessa Shkovitz, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the latest numbers show that over 122 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced, either due to persecution, conflicts, violence or human rights violations. Indeed, for 12 years in a row now, the number of refugees has increased, and that situation is worsening due to climate change. Andrew Harper is the Special Advisor on Climate Action of the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. Earlier, he joined Monocle's Carlotta Rebello to talk about how conflict and climate are increasingly linked when it comes to displacement and what he's been seeing in the field.
I think it's a very accurate description that the Global Risk Report came out with. We're seeing more and more people being displaced by conflict around the world. There's about 122 million people at the moment who have been displaced from the Americas to Africa to South Asia. And on top of that, we're seeing, as you're well aware, increasing climatic changes, which are compounding that. And so there is a relationship, but may not be as direct as what people say. It's not climate change and conflict. It's climate change aggravating food insecurity, leading to crop failures. It means that governments are not getting the revenue that they used to achieve before, and so they're not being able to provide the education or healthcare. They're failing on the services that they should be providing. And that leads to increasing discontent. But something which we're also finding very much is that in the past, we'd be seeing refugees, and a refugee is somebody who's crosses an international border due to conflict. We'd see them returning after that conflict has finished. But we're seeing more and more that conflicts are not being solved, and people are not returning. And even when they are being resolved, what people have got to go back to is like desert or lands which no longer can support populations. So we're seeing an increasing prolongation of refugee displacement. So more and more conflicts. As I mentioned, 122 million people being displaced at the moment. Some 60,000 people being displaced by weather events every day. And so we're seeing a combination. But one of the things which I'm really concerned about is not just what's happening now, but the lack of vision in terms about what's going to be happening in the future. We need to be looking at science. We need to be looking at the data. We need to be talking to the local populations and sort of saying, what are you actually expecting? What will impact? What will be the situation when the temperature increases by 1.5 or 2 degrees? How will that affect crops? How will that affect access to water? So all these issues combine to increase vulnerability of populations, conflict, violence, and then displacement. Often people can sort of say climate change, conflict, but that almost gives a get out of jail free card for many states who sort of say we can't do anything. Of course they can do something. States have got a responsibility to their citizens to protect them, to provide the basic services to them. And what we'd like to see is for those countries who have opened their borders for refugees to be provided with the support that they require in order to provide education, healthcare, access to livelihoods. And this is where it's so important that refugees and host communities are supported so that people are not forced to become even more vulnerable and go even further afield.
I'm curious to hear about, about the particular challenges when, in providing humanitarian aid, when you're dealing with people who have been displaced or become refugees as a consequence of extreme climate events, because that seems to me that it's has to be quite a different response than what, let's say, we're used to seeing, because it is a different scenario when, if an entire town disappears.
Yeah. As I sort of mentioned before, we're not necessarily seeing people returning. Mm-hmm. And so we hope for the best, which is people to return back in safety and dignity, but that's just not happening now. And so the past responses have always been emergency. You basically, there was something which was called trucking and chucking. You basically get into an area, get emergency support there, keep people alive. But that's not tenable anymore. We have to look at how do you provide dignified responses which support the integration as much as possible of displaced populations with host communities. And we cannot ignore host communities because the host communities provide the protection to the refugees. So we're very much looking at how do we engage more sustainable responses. It's one of the reasons why we're in Davos, because if you just have a humanitarian response, that has a short-term time frame. We need to get the private sector, we need to get development agencies involved in displacement settings. Because if you want to have a sustainable response, you need to have people who have a sense of future, have a hope for the future, have jobs, have education, have a dignified sense of community. And this is why it's so important to get the private sector engaged. At the moment, refugee settings, fragile states, this is outside of their comfort zone. And what we're here, and a number of other agencies are here, is to bring the reality of the people who can't be in Davos to Davos. It
brings to, as you have been describing, the idea of dignity, providing dignity when, displaced people are forced to seek shelter, seek refuge elsewhere. And everyone deserves the right to a dignified life, to a safety, to have ambitions and fulfill their dreams. And that can only be done exactly by bringing in the private sector, by ensuring cities, local authorities, nations are prepared. What are some of the mechanisms or some of the ways in which UNHCR is engaging with all these stakeholders to ensure they are prepared when or if they become host nations? And what can their side learn from you to be prepared for that eventuality?
Yeah. Well, there's very little that people can learn from us. We're always learning from the communities and the countries that are hosting refugees. So the first thing is we talk to the populations, we talk to the governments and sort of say, what is it that you need to build the resilience, build your capacity to adapt? And largely it's money. I don't want us to always go about money, but you can't deal with resilience and adaptation unless you've got the funds to do it. You can't protect the environment unless you've got support. You can't employ people to have nurseries or to provide education unless you've got money. So money is absolutely key. But the other thing which we've been looking at is how do we encourage best practices from different regions to be implemented at scale. So rather than looking at destructive types of agriculture, how do you have climate smart agriculture? How do you use renewable energy much more in areas that don't even have access to energy? So we're almost jumping over what we'd consider as natural, like we use of fossil fuels. When you don't have access to generators or fossil fuels, you've got a ready market for renewable energies, photovoltaic cells. And so this is something which we've been looking at. So one of the refugee camps in Jordan, which I used to help manage many years ago, we introduced renewable energy, one of the largest renewable energy plants in the world. And that provision of energy at very low cost promoted the creation of 3,000 little businesses in the refugee camp. That refugee camp, those businesses then drew in resources and products from the surrounding host community, so you actually increase the overall productivity. So around the world, we see that when refugees are allowed in and able to access the market and are provided with energy, sustainable energy, we see an increase in the GDP. So everyone wins. We want to empower refugees. We want to give people the opportunity to support themselves, their families, their communities. But this then comes down to something which is more than humanitarian support. This then becomes development. government. This then becomes the private sector. So if you don't have that engagement with the private sector, people are always going to be dependent. So this is where there's huge opportunities to be doing good.
That was Andrew Harper of the UNHCR in conversation with Monocle's Carlotta Rebello at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tessa Szyszkowicz and Yossi Meckelberg. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.